With that, we move to our distinguished final panel, which is composed of legislative representatives from UNRWA donor states. Of course, the United States is the lead donor to UNRWA, giving more than $300 million a year. And we're honored to have Representative Chris Smith from the U.S. Congress, who's flown in here to Geneva to be with us here today. I'm just going to say a word or two about Chris Smith. He's someone who has been extremely active in promoting human rights in Congress for many years. He was elected in 1980. The laws that he's brought include the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 to combat sex and labor trafficking in the U.S. and around the world. He's introduced laws that were passed to help individuals with autism, laws to promote religious freedom, and many other human rights causes. Currently, Representative Smith serves as chairman of the Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations. In that capacity, he has been one of the world leaders, if not the world leader, on holding UNRWA to account for all the issues that we're talking about today. I'm sure he'll mention it, but I just want to show he is the author of Stop Support for UNRWA, Agency Act of 2024. This is an essential piece of legislation that passed in the Foreign Affairs Committee recently. Representative Smith has invited me numerous times to speak in Congress. Here at the United Nations, I've been interrupted and shut down. They've removed my name from the speakers list numerous times, but Congressman Smith, on the contrary, gave us the floor and was able to speak about many of these things, including presenting this report. And I'll just say a word and then I'll conclude, is that January 30th, Congressman Smith, Chairman Smith, convened a hearing, a joint hearing of two subcommittees to deal with UNRWA failures and incitement to terrorism. And knowing that that was on the calendar when it was revealed about the UNRWA staff complicit in terrorism just a few days before, I believe that was an essential factor in prompting the United States. They knew that they were going to come up with this hearing, and America decided they're suspending funding, and then you had a cascade of all the other countries, Canada, European countries, Australia, all suspended. And I want to give credit for that to Congressman Smith for being the leader and making all of this happen. You have the floor.
Hello, thank you so very much. It's an honor to be on a panel with my fellow parliamentarians. Thank you for the great work you're doing in your respective Congresses or parliaments. I also want to say to Ayelet, I add my voice to everyone here in asking that Secretary General Gutierrez meet with her, do it now. You know, there's an old saying that if you say you don't have the time, you haven't stated a fact, you've stated a priority. And he needs to make this a priority. To watch that video, when I first saw it a couple days ago, I was moved to tears. And now I just saw it again, and it's like, this is barbaric, what this UNRWA person has done and what so many others who are part of UNRWA and Hamas have been doing. So special thanks to Hillel for his extraordinary work in exposing and confronting pervasive anti-Semitism in the United Nations, including at the UN Human Rights Council, right behind us right now, and of course UNRWA, but other specialized agencies and the General Assembly and elsewhere, and for demanding respect for the state of Israel and for Jews everywhere. In the past 9 months alone, Hillel has testified at count them, three separate congressional hearings that I've chaired, last June, then again in November, and then, as he just mentioned, the joint hearing with my good friend and colleague, Chairman Brian Mast, on January 30th. Hillel is incisive, he is compelling, and he is a truth teller. He told us that UN bodies routinely apply a double standard to Israel. We all know that, but it needs to be said. And I remember back in 2002, I had a hearing when we were pushing the idea of having a large meeting at the OSCE. I was the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, which is the OSCE part in the United States. And we had Natan Sharansky come and testify, one of the greatest. I tried to get to see him with Frank Wolf in the 1980s. We went to Perm Camp, and he had just been released. He is an amazing, awesome human rights defender. Well, he had a recipe or a definition that is not often realized by people here in the United Nations, and that was the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism: demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. And Hillel hit that out of the park in showing how the UN has done that everywhere here and in New York at the United Nations. He also talked about human rights officials like Navi Pillay and Francisco Albanese, called them out, quoted them to show how brazenly anti-Semitic they are and continue to be, and they're in high positions of power. And he'd also explain with chilling precision how UNRWA indoctrinates Palestinian youth. And really, I would ask everybody watching this, if you haven't done it recently, reread the Hamas Charter of 1988. I read major portions of it on the floor of the House, and even though I've read it many times, it got me anew. And grabbed me anew just how hate-filled it is. One of them is that if you see a Jew and that Jewish person is behind a rock, that the rock itself will cry out, "There's a Jew here, come and kill that person." It is perverse, and yet UNRWA embodies that in their teaching, especially for children. Earlier this month, as Hillel just mentioned, the House Foreign Affairs Committee debated and passed my bill, H.R. 7122, to stop support for UNRWA Act, and the vote was 30 to 19. The legislation now heads to the full House for a debate and a vote. It prohibits any contributions to UNRWA or to the regular budget of the United Nations for the support of UNRWA. In order to meet existing or future humanitarian needs in Gaza, it explicitly states that, quote, "nothing in this act may be construed to preclude the provision of humanitarian assistance to any agency or entity," but then it has a caveat. The Secretary of State has to certify that those entities or individuals don't promote violence, terrorism, or anti-Semitism. So we vet them before U.S. taxpayer money flows. Meanwhile, the United States Senate has passed legislation in mid-February that appropriates humanitarian aid for Gaza, estimated at $1.4 billion. And it, too, says clearly, unmistakably, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, no money to UNRWA. UNRWA is a corrupt, anti-Semitic terror complicit agency, and everybody needs to say that, and everybody here at the United Nations, including at the UN Human Rights Council and every other agency, need to recognize it. It radicalizes Palestinian children with anti-Semitic hate. It's a child soldier factory. I had hearings in the past, and I actually had some of our witnesses with the textbooks, reading the hate that is filled to overflowing in those textbooks, and it was amazing. They're teaching kids, youngest of ages, to hate Jews, and we wonder why these child soldiers grow up when they're 12 or 13, or and they're ready to kill any Jew that they come in contact with. We all know about the pause. I'm very concerned that the pause will be short-lived, and will unfortunately, the investigation appears to be woefully and unnecessarily limited in scope. It remains to be seen whether the investigation will be an in-depth and comprehensive, top-to-bottom investigation into UNRWA's direct role in promoting anti-Semitic hate, to include all the staff and look at the books, look at everything. If they just narrowly look at the 12, I can tell you they're going to say they've been removed, everything's done, move on, and now resume the funding. And that would be an egregious error if that happens. I also remain, like you do, very concerned about the UN investigations, not just as to who's doing them, but they're going to do the same thing. Look at the 12 and then move on. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal, it's an op-ed by Peter Anthony Gallo, who worked for the UN OIOS, and the headline was, "The sham investigation of UNRWA is likely to whitewash the organization's terrorist ties and could even force the offenders forced rehiring." And, my good friend Ed just made so many good comments about how flawed those processes are and have been for decades. And now we're in real time. We're about to see this happen all over again. Peter Gallo says, after spending 4 years as an investigator, I can confidently say that the UN investigation will amount to nothing. He went on to say that, among other concerns, he argues, Secretary Guterres has said any UNRWA employee involved will be held accountable, including through criminal prosecution. Really? That's commendable, he goes on, but it's meaningless. The UN doesn't have prosecutorial authority or the ability to extradite people from one country to another, meaning any legal accountability would have to come from the national authorities. Whatever the UN says, Hamas certainly won't send them from Gaza to sit for a criminal trial in Israel. UNRWA's deplorable record of anti-Semitism is nothing new. Nothing new. My good friend from New Jersey, from Washington, who was here today, who just spoke from the USAID perspective, she's been calling it for at least a dozen years, and there's been a multi-year cover-up. I've tried for over 20. In 2003, I offered an amendment to a State Department bill for 2003-4 that said no money for UNRWA. It passed the House, got killed in the Senate by inaction, and everything went on as usual. And the UNRWA lobbyists would descend on Capitol Hill, talk to members and staff, and say, oh, everything's fixed. We can move on, turn that page. And nothing could be further from the truth. So, that goes back, and I really focused in that amendment on the textbooks, because I was appalled, like all of you were, at how bad it is. As was mentioned by Mr. Lindsay before, in 2018, Trump rightfully suspended all U.S. funding to UNRWA, as he should, based on the record. Unfortunately, it was backfilled by our friends in the European Union. Since 2021, the Biden administration has resumed lavish support from UNRWA, and we've spoken out. We have not been listened to. And he has donated more than $1 billion. Years to date, U.S. taxpayers have spent about a little over $7 billion on UNRWA, despite all of its horrific flaws. Finally, pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 2720, Secretary General Guterres named Sigrid Kaag as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. Among the job description is to facilitate, coordinate, monitor, and verify humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza. However, according to the Times of Israel, Sigrid is an outgoing Dutch minister. That's fine. She's married to a senior PLO member and deputy minister under Yasser Arafat. She cast Netanyahu as a racist. And then, most egregious, in my opinion, she worked for UNRWA. So what kind of empathies will she have? And it does beg the question, should we be concerned about that? If we let it, it'll be business as usual. And the factory that creates all of these kids who learn to hate. Any of you ever watch South Pacific, the great musical? There's a great song in there, you've got to be taught. You've got to be taught to hate. That's what UNRWA does. That's what Hamas does. And we will get no change, and this cycle of violence will persist. This is the time. Thank you for your great leadership.